With the COVID-19 pandemic in mind, our 2022 speaker series focuses on overall health, mental and physical. So in addition to our speakers, during each session, the UCLA Mindful Awareness Research Center will offer a mindfulness exercise. I'm now pleased to introduce Dr. Marvin Belzer. Dr. Belzer, PhD, has taught mindfulness meditation for 20 years. He is an adjunct associate professor in the UCLA Department of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences. He teaches an undergraduate course at UCLA and mindfulness in many different venues. So Dr. Belzer, you can go ahead and I will pin you to the screen.
Hey everyone, it's good to be here with you today. I was here at the first session last month and I guess it went well enough that I'm back. And so I have 10 minutes. You might be surprised that we're going to do a mindfulness exercise as part of this session. I hope it's useful. I don't assume it's for everyone, so take it with a grain of salt if you're not necessarily that interested. But what we have found is that most people are welcoming the opportunity to kind of learn what mindfulness is and how we can practice it and how it might be beneficial. I will say as I begin that at the UCLA Mindful Awareness Research Center, we do have guided meditations in Spanish, and they're freely available on our website, along with other languages as well. So I'll talk a little bit for a minute about what mindfulness is and how we practice it in a meditation, and then I'll lead a meditation for a few minutes that you're welcome to try, and then talk briefly about how we use mindfulness with difficult states such as physical pain or difficult emotions like anxiety or grief. And then we'll conclude with a brief kindness practice, and we'll do all this in 10 minutes. The less time I have, the better I teach. I shouldn't waste it with bad jokes, right? Mindfulness is a capacity that we all have. It's not something esoteric that we have to struggle to create or figure out. It's the ability to be aware of what's happening in our experience moment by moment, what we hear, see, smell, and what we feel in our bodies, our thoughts, emotions, and so forth. And it's also a capacity that we can refine and develop. And where the science comes in is just looking, if you're studying insomnia, for instance, can mindfulness help with insomnia? Just do some measures, have a 6-week course, maybe do the measures again, where the core of the course will be what we'll do in these few minutes. So what we do in a meditation is relatively simple. I like to break it into 2 parts. The first is we direct our attention to something actually happening in our experience that's relatively neutral, meaning not stimulating, right? Not especially drawing our attention. And there's something about the central nervous system, our brains, which is such that when we do this for a little while, there are remarkable effects, calming down, more clarity, more stability, and so forth. And so when we do the meditation, I'll invite you to notice the sounds you can hear around you, notice sensations in your bodies, the sensations connected with the breath. This is definitely doable, right? You may not want to do it, but that's fine. But if you want to try, it's definitely something you can do. And we don't have to clear our minds. It's a misconception about meditation. We don't have to change anything. We can do this right in the midst of everything else that may be happening. And so I'll guide you in this in a moment. So that's the first part. The second is, even though I just gave a pep talk that it's doable, what also happens is our minds are used to being very active and moving quickly from one thing to another to another. And so even when we want to try, right? Okay, let me give this a shot. Okay. 5 seconds later, 10 seconds later, we notice that we're daydreaming, or 2 minutes later, right? We notice, wait a minute, I was going to try, but I've spent this entire time now daydreaming, fantasizing, worrying. This is perfectly normal when people try to meditate. It's our intelligence kicking in, really. As human beings, we're really good at paying attention to what needs to be paid attention to. And so quite naturally, If I ask myself just to observe the sensations connected with my breath, my intelligence kicks in at some point, and thoughts are so fast, right? And so when we realize our attention has drifted, we haven't failed, it's normal, and we include whatever is there, whatever is there. This is part of mindfulness practice. We have that permission. Part of the meditation is permission just to be real. Notice what's happening with emotions. There are sensations often in the torso that we can feel, and then gently come back to the breath. So let's give it a shot if you wish. So let's take, we'll take 3 minutes for this. So eyes can be open or closed. You might take a few deeper breaths as we begin, slightly deeper in breath and out breath. Just one way to begin. Letting your breath be normal. We'll come back to the breath in a few seconds. For now, just notice the sounds you can hear. Notice how easy this is. You don't have to censor any sounds. You don't have to organize. You don't have to keep track. Just in the midst of everything that's happening for you right now, notice you can direct your attention to this part of your experience and just kind of like, okay, what is this changing flow of sounds around me, in me? So opening to sounds is a fine way to meditate. It's also good to practice with our bodies. So when you wish, let your attention settle into your body. Just notice what you can feel: head, shoulders, arms, hands, torso, legs, feet, actual sensations, vibration, pressure, softness. So we feel into our bodies. It can be natural to notice the sensations connected with the breath, just the normal breath now, abdomen, chest, or nose. How do you know you're breathing? Some sensations, right? Slight rising, tensing in the abdomen, chest, falling, dissolving with the out breath. So we spend time doing this because it actually has good effects. Doesn't solve all our problems, that's for sure, but it can help us develop more calmness, clarity. And then when you notice your attention has drifted, just including whatever it is. Just that recognition, thinking, planning, worrying, and gently come back. So we just take another 30 seconds for this. Even noticing one breath is not a small thing. And then it's a free space just to be real, not performing, and so forth. So thank you. It's good to practice with you. The basics are really quite simple. We have this capacity to direct our attention. We have choice about where we place our attention. Even if you're living with a lot of physical pain, you can decide where to place attention. And this is one of the clinical applications that's been well researched. It's useful to help us manage the pain. It doesn't magically make it disappear, but it can help manage it. Likewise with anxiety, fear, grief, we include the feel of it without trying to fix it, and then always with that permission to come back. So I teach at the Mindful Awareness Research Center at UCLA. We do have a free app called UCLA Mindful with guided meditations in both English, Spanish, and other languages. I said we would do a kindness practice, and I hate to shortchange it. It is a practice where we turn our attention to the goodness in someone. And so we should have more time for it, but 10 seconds. Think of someone in your life who you appreciate anyone, could be a non-human animal, pet. Notice one thing you really like about them and wish them well. May you be happy. Ding. So that can be done more. That is a beautiful practice that goes well with the basics of mindfulness. My 10 minutes is up. Thank you for your attention. It was good to be with you today again.
Thank you, Dr. Velser, for that mindfulness practice and just sensation perception that we got to experience. So thank you. Alrighty, let's get started on our talk today. I'm now pleased to introduce our speakers, Dominique Harrison and Susana Lopez, our trainers for today. And pin them so we can see our lovely speakers. Alrighty, so Dominique is a curriculum developer and trainer at the DMH UCLA Prevention Center of Excellence. Dominique has co-created and facilitated online and in-person training sessions on implicit bias, sensitive communication, trauma, and resilience-informed care, emotional intelligence, and professional well-being for people across Los Angeles County. As a racial equality expert on her team, Dominique strives to help others build awareness, have challenging conversations, and uplift marginalized and disenfranchised Black, Indigenous, and people of color voices. And Dr. Susana Lopez is a bicultural and bilingual English and Spanish licensed clinical psychologist and educator who specializes in culturally humble and trauma-informed psychological intervention and training for underserved communities. As an immigrant herself, Dr. Lopez
Right, so I think we may have lost Brittany. I'm going to finish the introduction. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, okay, thank you so much. So Brittany will be back, I'm sure. And in the meantime, we'll finish introducing Dr. Lopez. As an immigrant herself, Dr. Lopez has a passion for working with families on issues related to life transition, immigration and acculturation processes, and community health. Both personally and professionally, Dr. Lopez is passionate about doing anti-racism work and strives for a just community for all. In addition, she is a parent of 3 young daughters and enjoys volunteering, reading, and exploring as a family. With that, we'll advance the slide and we will turn it over to our trainers. Thank you so much to both of you for being here with us today.
Thanks so much for having us. Susana, if it's okay, I'll start us off with naming my positionality, and then I'll turn it over to you. So again, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. It's great to be here with you all. Positionality or social location or cultural identity, however you name it, is super important to name in any space that you are in. And it's something that I value having the opportunity to do. So I'm going to share a little bit about me. My name is Dominique Harrison. I am a 32-year-old cisgender Black woman, and I am able-bodied. And I've actually had the amazing economic privilege to love school and be able to attend multiple professional programs because of it. So I have 2 master's degrees, as you see at the end of my name. Yes, very, very hilarious in that way, but I love school, and I'm thankful for the economic privilege that has been given to me to do so. Another really important quality of mine and identity is I'm also a descendant of enslaved people with inherited resiliency. And I will turn it over to Susana.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I am so excited to be here today as well. So I am a 38-year-old Latina, Mexican American, specifically heterosexual cisgender woman. I am an immigrant born in Mexico, raised here in the United States. So I lived kind of in two worlds my whole life. I as well have a lot of educational privilege in that way that comes with some financial privilege as well. And I am the descendant of indigenous people who were stripped away from their cultural identities, which is something we'll talk about today. And I am in the process of reclaiming my identity as well. So thank you for having us. So the next slide here, if we can advance, thank you. This is what we will focus on today in our learning objectives. We will first define bias and personal and social impacts of that bias within resource families and what that means specifically. We will discuss briefly the history of foster care and child welfare system, as well, as that's very important to consider in terms of context. And then we will explore ways to empower and support the identities of youth in foster care and that are in care of many of you here today. So that's our plan for today, and all this in an hour. So next slide, please. Okay. So one thing that we sometimes talk about, or you maybe have heard, is this idea of a safe place, right? So historically, when we have these conversations or trainings, sometimes you hear individuals talking about a safe place to have this. We want to invite you, Dominique and I, to move into a brave space. So it's a new way to frame dialogue specifically about race, diversity, and social justice and the way we see things. And this is because safe has been historically used by dominant groups to mean comfortable. And a lot of times comfortable means the norm and keeping things as they are. So we are shifting from that, and talking about race is a lot of times uncomfortable. And we don't really talk about how to talk about that. So a lot of us don't maybe know how to do that. So inviting you today to this brave space and working through your discomfort. There might be things that we say today that might be uncomfortable, and that's okay. Being able to sit with it and understand it. And obviously we'll have moments for questions and things of sorts, but part of that growth comes with feeling uncomfortable, right? So when you exercise and you're gaining muscle, that it's not very comfortable all the times, right? And so, but there is some progress happening. So being able to have this dialogue with you today while taking care of yourself, because these are difficult topics to talk about, and also inviting you to distinguish people from ideas. So being able to separate that and understand that our ideas come from our environments and our experiences and our upbringings, and they don't necessarily always equate to the individual. Sometimes they do, but not always. And also own your own intentions. We'll talk more about intentions versus impact, but owning what your intentions are when we do say something, or we do speak, or we do act, and what impact does that have on the other individual as well. And then we want to invite you, obviously, to always honor differences and disagreement in a respectful way, and being able to acknowledge that in this talk today.
Thank you, Susanna. And so let's talk a little bit about bias. I think it's super important to create a space to talk about how human bias is and how it might lead us to interact with the people around us, whether we are caregivers ourselves, work in foster care systems, or connected to resource families. It's really important to talk about how bias impacts the way we perceive things, the way we behave, and the way in which we think about things. So I want to take a little bit of time to break this down for us in a very clear way. And I'm open to engaging in chat discussion or conversations or questions that come up along the way. And next slide, please. So, it's not enough just to talk about biases and to reflect only the unconscious bits of bias. When it comes to the work that we do, it's super important to acknowledge how bias is a culmination of the things that are unconscious to us, the things that we have consciously put into practice, whether that be positive or negative, and the ways in which the world and the narrative around that has been created in our society keeps us or structures us to connect to or disconnect from certain ways of being, certain ways of connecting. And so it's really important to not only, because I imagine a lot of us have had implicit bias trainings in our past, maybe even have had an implicit bias training with me, because I've done it many a time here at UCLA and across with our Los Angeles County folks. But it's super important that we make a connection that this is all interconnected. Next slide, please. So why is bias such a big deal? If you could advance. So biases really have a tremendous impact on the way we operate in the world. And that looks like behaviors, that looks like perceptions, thoughts, feelings, that looks like the decisions we make and how we make them. And so one thing I want to really hone in on is that bias is superhuman. Everyone has them, none of us are exempt. But what we have the ability to do is challenge ourselves when those biases lead us to interact discriminatorily or behave in a way that might limit someone's acceptance into a space, might challenge someone's experience of belonging, and even lead to really clearly racism, any type of phobias, sexism of any type with anyone we interact with, especially those that have less power than us, AKA youth and youth of color and foster care. So if you would please, next slide. I'm a quotes person. You'll know that in my sections, I have quotes. And I just want to highlight this. The Kirwan Institute, for anyone who's not familiar, is a really great resource for any and all things bias related. So I would encourage you to check that out. But actions and decisions resulting from our implicit biases can create real world barriers to equity and opportunity. Super important to talk about equity and opportunity when it comes to youth of color. Youth of color that are stepping into temporary or even long-term stays with resource families that might be different from them culturally, might have a difference in how we interact, what communities we're in, what communities we're connected to. And so whenever I do this work, it's super important that we are highlighting that equity has a huge role here. And next slide. So I think it's important to have a shared understanding when we do this work. So a quick definition on implicit bias so that we're all familiar. Strategically, it is the combination of having a brain and living in society. And what that means is we're all human, we all have it. It is literally founded and grounded in us. But it is defined as the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, our actions, and our decisions, like I shared in the last slide, in an unconscious manner. So what does that mean? It happens without our awareness and intentional control. It reflects human nature and socialization. And again, I can't say this enough, everyone has biases. Next slide. So what's important to talk about when we connect to biases? A couple of things that I want to highlight is that, yeah, thank you. Sorry about that. We love animation, but sometimes it happens very quickly. So implicit bias is pervasive. And what I mean by pervasive is that everyone possesses them. It's in everything that we do. It's in the air. It's how we behave, how we act, how we interact, how we question things, how we respond to things, how we say yes to things. But implicit bias, our biases are actually also malleable, meaning they can be changed. For many of us, it's like, well, it's unconscious. It happens without our attention or awareness. But what we can do in order to change our unconscious or implicit biases is to slow down, right? Give ourselves the opportunity to stop and explore and question and be curious. right? So the more we give ourselves the space to explore, to pause, to maybe even have an opportunity to summarize what we're thinking and summarize what someone else is saying, we can actually have the power to change some of the more negative unconscious thoughts we have. By unconscious, our implicit biases are unconscious, they're automatic. More often than not, they favor our own in-group, meaning we set more positive narratives and tones for those who we share a community group or a characteristic group with. And most importantly, it does not align with our explicit beliefs. When we have access to the slides again, I'll continue us. Hi, Taylor.
Hi, I'm so sorry to everybody. America is having some internet challenges, so I'm going to just take one moment and put up your slides and I'll advance them for you. Okay. So
Okay.
One moment. Sorry to interrupt.
That's okay. And while we have a moment, we'll give Taylor a few more minutes. But if anyone has any thoughts or questions, feel free to, or even just a comment that you want to share in the chat. We'd love to hear from you.
Anything, we're here. Anything. Okay.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Taylor, so much.
Yes. Okay,
Yes.
we have a comment here. And it's saying it's important to recognize that we all have biases.
Agreed.
Yes, essential.
Yeah, it's super essential, right? I think the more we honor that, the more it becomes a reality. It's not just enough that we take the onus on ourselves to say like, oh, I'm going to learn more about biases, right? We have to learn it. We also have to know that this is just, even if we don't learn about it, that this is just a part of how we operate in the world. It's very brain connected. Thank you, Taylor. So if you would just mind clicking once and allowing the words to show up again. Yeah. So we just finished that section. I just want to reiterate, implicit biases are pervasive, malleable. They're not always aligned with our explicit beliefs. They are unconscious and automatic, and they favor our own in-group. So what are some things that we should consider that happen when things happen in the world, right? We're more likely to have biases or make biased connected decisions when, and if you could just click, Taylor, click once, perfect. So I want to highlight a couple things that happen. So first, when we are in situations that have a lot of ambiguity, right? We don't have all the facts, we don't have all the resources, we can find ourselves being or connecting to a more biased decision. When we have time constraints, when we're limited with time, when we have to do things fast, right, which is very common in our current world, we can find ourselves making more biased decisions. When we find ourselves to, rely so much on objectivity, I'm going to be honest, I don't believe anything is objective when it comes to being human. Everything is subjective. So I would actually encourage you to say, maybe my life, in the experiences that I have, the narratives that I've created, have a sort of a tent to them, meaning an individual thought process that is tied to it, right? Our feelings, emotions, and thoughts all tied to that narrative and create it and make it subjective. So I want to challenge you all to, think like when we use the word objective, is that really what I mean here? And also when we're stressed, right? Biases always come up and they always challenge us even more when things are stressful. So as it relates to interacting with youth of color in foster care, and anyone that is that we interact with on a daily basis, it's really important to know that having the opportunity to slow down, to take a breath, to not be so focused on having a response to someone's question or comment, but like sitting in the space with them, acknowledging what they said and honoring what they're in need of, can be super important in challenging us from making biased decisions. Next slide. And I told you I love quotes. Dr. Mahazaran Banaji is a well-known psychologist, sociologist, who's done a lot of work around implicit biases in general. She created the project Implicit, which is where you can take the implicit association test and really challenge yourselves around how you associate words, images with different narratives in your mind. She basically says here, even the most well-meaning person unwittingly allows unconscious thoughts and feelings to influence seemingly objective decisions. Love that she put seemingly there. And what that means for us is that we are all well-meaning. We all don't mean to harm anyone with our words, our actions, and our thoughts. But sometimes our unconscious connection, the way in which we've been socialized, the neighborhood we've grown up in, who we've interacted with, will come through our interactions and the way we provide for others in our space. So we just need to be more mindful. Next slide. So I always think it's super important to talk about the history and to really ground ourselves in where we came from in order to make connection to how these things still impact us now, or how they are storing the way in which we think about the child welfare and foster care system. Next slide. So let's talk history. I think it's important to kind of break down the ways in which children who either have been separated from their families due to death, due to a parent's or caregiver's inability to support them, have happened throughout the years. So let's start with indentured work. In the 1700s, orphans and children whose parent could not care for them were often like indentured out to work for families. So you find children would be sent to different homes to work on farms, and they would spend hours a day, like hours on end, supporting that family or supporting that business or supporting that land. Then we get orphanages, which started around the 1800s. If you would just mind clicking the next in the slide. By the early 1800s, we have orphanages or buildings that were buildings or spaces or small homes that were created to invite children who have lost connection to their families due to death or inability to support and care for them. And were mostly run by charitable organizations and religious institutions. And then we have our first stint of what I would call foster homes in around the 1850s. And if you can click next. So what happens with foster homes is that it was our attempt to allow for children to be funneled in smaller numbers into homes to connect with families. And what was hard though is like we had willing individuals who said, I want to invite these children into our home. And then they were invited into their home. But after that happened, the agency seldom monitored placements. And so what we found is that a lot of children actually were returning back to indentured work, were not cared for in the ways in which biological children in the home would be cared for. And so what this led us to is to having the opportunity to start to put some policies in place to change that. If you wouldn't mind advancing the slide. And so I'm going to just briefly touch on these because these are so exhaustive. I would encourage you all to learn more about these because again, grounding ourselves in the history and the knowledge around policy is super important for sitting in a space of acknowledgement around what's happening today. I'm going to highlight two of them for today's lesson and work, but just quickly, there are 6 well-known policies. There's even more now because there's addendums and amendments, but I want to talk about these 6. So the Social Security Act of 1935 would be the act that authorized the first federal grant for child welfare, meaning caring for children who are positioned or taken from their homes due to some sort of death or inability to pay and care for a child. Then we transitioned to the Aid to Dependent Children policy, which was to help, it was a financial-based program, which helped specifically within states, and states would provide financial assistance to dependent children in need. Be very conscious of the word children, right? Not family, but children in need. We then we then actually kind of set out this aided dependent children foster care specific policy, which happened around, I'd say, the 1950s, 1960s, where it was added as an add-on to the dependent children program, where its states received federal matched fundings, right? So states were first providing this funding, and then federal government came in and they matched with financial payments to the children who were removed from quote unquote unsuitable homes. Then we have the Child Abuse Prevention Act of 1974, which requires states to establish child abuse reporting procedures. And then we don't have anything until 97, which was the Adoption and Safe Families Act, which was designed to ensure that child safety, permanency, and well-being were paramount when we think about removing children from their original homes to temporary resource families and or long-term and then permanent adoption. And then last, the Foster Connection to Success is a 2008, if you can believe it, a 2008 policy that increased opportunities for children to be placed with relatives. This is where we start to see like kinship care be really highlighted and thought of and prioritized, and an expanded incentives to encourage adoptions from foster care. Next slide. So I'm going to take some time to just talk about two, and specifically some things that we want to be mindful of how these two policies are talked about. So the aided dependent children, if you'll just advance it, it's fine to just advance it through. Congress authorized federal funding for foster care payments made on behalf of children who were removed from unsuitable homes, right? Now, I think we have to be really mindful of who's defining and what does define unsuitable. And the next bullet talks about Congress would continue to aid a child, right? Not the family, not the caregiver, in addition to the child, but a child in the home while making arrangements for the child to live elsewhere. So if you can think about this, we're giving money to the child or holding it in a space for the child without thinking about how we can provide funds to support the child within that original family or biological family or kinship family to support themselves and to become more resourced. Next, we have the Adoption and Safe Families Act, which talks about like we want to ensure child safety, right? But again, it encouraged states to expedite permanent decisions, permanency around decisions. So adoption over kinship care, and then or helping families return their children back to kin or biological caregivers. We also promote an increased number of adoptions. So when you're increasing the number, right, that means we're doing things a little bit faster than we should, right? And then there was even an adoption incentive. So all of these things, I think, are tied to a bias that's been created about what it means to take a child from an unsuitable home and move them into a place that we have deemed suitable. And who's the we? Federal government, state entities. And we have to be really mindful about how we're not involving the family story, the family narrative, into how we decide what happens to this child. And next slide. And we're going to transition to Susanna's section about personal and social impacts. But just a quick note around as we like kind of culminate that last section, because there's a lot there. I want you to be mindful about when we are caregivers, right? There's always power. There's always power imbalances. And whether you are caring for biological or foster care youth of color, it's important to know that we are always going to put our own narratives on them, right? So if you can just slow down, ground yourselves in your experiences and give the youth the opportunity to explore their own experiences, how it's impacting them, and give yourself an opportunity to talk more about that distinctly, then we can get to a place where we aren't operating so much out of our own biases. And that's it for now. Susanna, thank you.
Thank you, Dominique. What a wonderful quick review of how policies and laws have impacted the youth today, in the past, and continue to impact youth today. So very, very important. And yes, we will talk more about personal and social impacts of those biases, because the biases don't just stay with us and in our purse or our backpack or wherever we carry our things. They really start impacting everything we do. And one of those things that you all do, and most of you here today, is care for foster youth. And specifically, we're talking about foster youth of color today. So we do know that in the United States that ethnically and racially, we are seeing more diverse youth, right? So there's a rapid increase in the number of diverse youth and those experiences. And even when we are from the same background, ethnic or racial background, there's so much variety within that experience, and not all the experience is the same. So let's talk a little bit more about those impacts of that. But before we go there, before we speak about the impact that has on our own relationship with our youth and our own thoughts with that, let's take a moment to acknowledge the resilience of so many human beings in the world, specifically these youth. Resilience, I'm sure that is something you've heard before. It really is where the individual is more likely to be able to withstand, negative things in their life, whether that be stress or traumas or outcomes. And one of them might be being removed from their biological families, or maybe that's part of their resilience, actually being away from that biological family, right? And so one of the things that plays a big role in resilient individuals is this idea of protective factors, right? So these are factors in the individual's life and the youth's life that can reduce or buffer and protect the probability of diagnoses, the probability of other at-risk behaviors, and increasing the probability of being able to connect with a new family as well. And what we also know is that youth under stress, especially extensive stress, chronic stress, with few of these protective factors, a lot of them are having a stable home and positive relationship with an adult that they care for, are at risk of these, we could say, negative things, emotional, behavioral, and other difficulties in their life. So what we're trying to do is prevent those, right? And we're trying to provide not only these protective factors to protect them from adverse conditions and traumas, but we want to go back and say, well, what do we have to do to not have them experience these adverse events and these traumas in the first place, right? Instead of doing this kind of solution after fact, so kind of more of a prevention model. And so one of the things that is really key for adolescents, if you all remember when you were an adolescent, is the sense of belonging and connecting, and that's part of developing, and that's part of the human experience. No matter what background you are, that's one thing we can kind of confidently say. And you remember that for some of you, maybe it was your friendships and how important those were, more maybe than some families, and those connections with other individuals, and a sense of belonging, knowing that you fit in, knowing that this is your place. And how do we create that when it's a new place and you're getting to know each other and you're trying to help them find a sense of belonging, but maybe they're having to let go of some identities, cultural identities, racial identities that they had that are very different maybe in the new setting, right? So if you could advance to the next slide, that would be great. Thank you. So one thing that you mentioned earlier, and I would like to kind of spend a little bit more time, is this idea of intention versus impact. And really considering how even like the biases that Dominique was saying, even the most well-intentioned individual that say, well, I'm just a nice person, we have these biases, right? And our intention might be really, really great to be able to say, well, maybe forget about that. Let's kind of move on and have you integrate into this new way of doing things. Maybe your attention is really positive, but the impact on the youth might not it might not match that intention. So we really need to consider how our own values and backgrounds and really impact those of the youth, right? Being able to consider that. And then impact is about what the other person is feeling, right? The other person is experiencing. So I can have really positive intention, but I don't know what that means for the other individual. And so we don't know what that means for the youth. So being able to have this dialogue and this awareness of that intention and impact don't always match. And we have to slow down, like Dominique say, and really understand, is my intention and my impact, or my impact, stemming from that intention? Does it match? Or maybe I need to really reevaluate what my intention is or my impact is, right? So if we can see the next slide. So I'm gonna give you, I don't know, Dominic, remind me if we're gonna read this out loud. I want you to read over this vignette, and I want you to take a moment to read it on your own. Is that what we agreed, right?
That's perfect. Yeah.
Read it on your own, and then we're gonna have a question at the end and being able to do a small reflection on this. But I'm gonna give you just a couple minutes here to read it.
Is there a way for you to make it bigger? I can't see it.
Taylor, I don't know. Maybe.
My name's not Taylor.
No, I'm sorry. Taylor is she's helping with administering the.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Sorry about that. I'm not the best with the slides, and I'm so sorry that we cannot make it bigger, but
I'm happy to read it as well, because it seems like some people see it and some people don't. So for those that don't see it, I'm sorry if you're kind of reading and hearing me at the same time, but I'll just kind of go ahead and read it.
I can see it. It's just the words are really small.
Okay. Would you like, I'll just read it as well. All right. Brianna is 13-year-old and Desmond is 12 years old. Were removed from their home after their mother was reported for child abuse and neglect. The children are placed with the Johnsons, who live over 30 plus miles away from their original home. Although they share some similarities to Brianna and Desmond, California natives, and attend church, the Johnsons are Latinx. Brianna and Desmond are Black, are strict in their parenting style, and cook meals that Brianna and Desmond are not used to. The Johnsons are well known within the resource family community as quote unquote model resource parents who have fostered for years and have a big home in a safe neighborhood. Okay, so hopefully everybody got an opportunity to either listen to me or read it. So we'll advance to the next slide. Okay, so we want you to take a couple minutes here to think about what should we take into consideration regarding Brianna and Desmond's placement with the Johnsons. And we're gonna invite you to respond to that in the chat, but we're gonna play just some background music to put us in that place of reflection. So if Taylor, if you could click on the play button on the black square here, rectangle, it should play the audio. I don't hear it, but.
Yeah, it's okay.
It's okay. You can just kind of reflect, look at these pretty fishes as you're kind of thinking about what we would have to consider for them, and being able to, put it in the chat. I can see the chat coming in, so that's great.
Yeah. Yeah, we got a lot of great responses in the chat.
Yes.
Mm.
We can advance to the next slide here, if that's okay.
I'm just going to take a moment to read a couple that we got in the chat. So not being physically near their friends, school, additional racial differences, physical and psychological safety, which is a really great thing to really consider. The distance, cultural norms, food, school academics, leaving school of origin, the distance, all great thoughts. And just want to highlight that I love the intersectional question we got at the end. Are they Afro-Latinx? So we were really, really hilarious in not to put like so much detail here, we wanted to gauge what any and all things that could come up that could present as an issue when it comes to interacting with the children, right? It's very, very beginning of the children being placed. So I love all the ways in which you're thinking about this. No answer is a wrong answer in this space. It's just more of like, what could be some potential considerations that we want to take into, we want to consider. So I'll stop there.
No, these are great thoughts. And it's, as you can see, not one thing. There's so many factors and so many things to consider. And not only specifically just to the Johnsons, but also if they're willing to be open for connections outside of the Johnsons. What does that even mean in that community, right? So beyond the family. Great. Okay, so I think. Okay, so that kind of frames, I want you to kind of continue to think about that as we move forward for our next slide. I think we should be in slide 24. If you want to start it there, but oh, I think I lost it, but okay, that's okay.
I'm so sorry, Susanna. Every time I click to change like the chat or the slides, the whole thing like restarts. So I'm really sorry. And I will share your slides once more. My apologies.
Yeah, that's good.
Thank you to everybody for your generous patience with the technology.
Part of what we've learned over the last 2 years, a lot of flexibility and patience. And that's what we are all about here, right?
I was going to say the same thing.
When working with you.
It gives us an opportunity to have grace and to slow down. So,
yes, which is a part of the message of our talk today. Grace and slow down. But some of the thoughts so I'm sure she'll pull it up as slide 24. Some of the thoughts on impact versus intent is really, I think it's really important to transition from like risk adverse, though she'll pull it up in a second, to risk tolerant considerations, meaning that often our fears drive, oh, here it is. No security alert. Oh, perfect. Yeah, just pull them all. Okay. Yeah, so oftentimes we sometimes think about our fears drive often feel family separations, right? And what does that mean in terms of family separations for the youth? And we need to consider that every aspect of life, there's a risk, and there's a lot of risk things involved for youth, and then being able to listen reflectively and consider the youth's protective factors and fostering that. And they're in there, just like we talked earlier about mindfulness and how it's not something we have to work really hard in. It's in us and being able to bring it out, the resilience is and the thriving is part of the youth experience, and being able to be mindful of that, considering that parental resilience, social connections, child development, knowledge of resources is really important. And the other one is partner with rather than dictate to. So being able to partner with the youth and consider the role that you're playing with the youth in your relationship with them. Is it collaborative? Is it a more dictatorship, kind of relationship? Is it, before we used to talk a lot about authoritarian versus authoritative, right? And so being really inclusive in our conversations with them, which we'll talk in a second more about, and in the decision making. And then creating a space for possible biological and kinship caregivers to connect, right? And being able to involve those caregivers in understanding of the youth development and youth process. If, I have to say, if safe, if appropriate, right? Every situation is different. Here we can advance to the next slide.
Okay, and so to just culminate the work we've done together thus far, it's always great to ground ourselves in some strategies on how we can challenge the ways in which our biases impact our interaction with youth of color. And also there's one element we're going to highlight. Biases are always interconnected with our behaviors, perceptions, and thoughts, but they can also, our biases can lead to racist behaviors, sexist behaviors, challenges in which we interact with things that feel uncomfortable for us. And so we're going to actually highlight a strategy that's specific to dialoguing about racism. So next slide. We've done it. We've done it today. One of the things that we're going to highlight is mindfulness, perspective taking, and then the last is conversations about bias and racism. We need to have conversations with our youth. We need to involve them in topics that would lead them to think a certain way and create space for curiosity. Next slide. Okay. So quick thing on mindfulness, it's super important. And it allows for us, mindfulness in itself is an opportunity for us to slow down. I've talked about slowing down so much, but it leads us to slow down in a very unique way. Next slide. I'm not going to go into too much detail because we had the pleasure of having Dr. Belzer talk about mindfulness, but I want to give you all an acronym. I love acronyms. And the acronym I'm going to talk about today is called RAIN with 2 N's. So RAIN stands for recognize, accept, investigate, non-identity or non-identify, and non-attach. And Taylor, you can just advance it to the end of that slide. So I'm going to talk about recognize. We recognize by pausing, observing from all angles, the obvious angles and the less so obvious, right? So giving ourselves the space to not be so limited or tunnel vision with our thought processes. We accept or allow, right? We release this tendency to reject, deny, or to change, or to be challenging or refusing of a reality, so to speak. And we accept. Accepting does not necessarily mean that we're accepting this thing forever, but we're giving ourselves the opportunity to pause long enough to really say or see something clearly, and really look into it to gather greater and deeper understanding. We investigate around us, right? With gentle, compassionate, and courageous investigation, where we are giving ourselves the opportunity to learn and grow in our self-awareness, and our empathy and our wisdom. We get to ask ourselves, like, what's going on for us right now in this moment that might lead us to feel discomfort? What's happening in our body? What's happening? Where are my thoughts going? What am I noticing I want to do next? Where is my, what am I feeling in my body? So we're tying into investigation around our own physical physical experience of something we've heard or have are talking about or responding to. Non-identity is about increasing our mind's flexibility. So learning to let go of tendencies to get stuck in that tunnel vision, that limited point of view, and giving ourselves the opportunity to not fixate on one narrative, but to actually identify ways in which the youth that we're interacting with, how they think, how their emotions are playing out in this space, how they are coming up. And then we non-attach. What that looks like is we open ourselves up to an experience that liberates us from negativity at any passing moment. So yes, feelings might come up, right? We might feel hurt or pain as we interact and have challenging conversations with youth. And we also might feel uncomfortable and hurt as we think about the ways in which we have impacted youth with our words, if we are not challenging ourselves to be as present about how our biases or maybe even racist thoughts, because that's just the narrative of America in which we lived in. If we're not giving ourselves more opportunity to acknowledge that that's happening, we're only limiting our way of thinking about something in that given moment. So allow yourself to experience a full set of emotions. And next slide. Alongside mindfulness, it's so super important a perspective take. And just a few thoughts on perspective taking. Many of us are aware of it, and it's literally talked about as taking a step in another person's shoes. And how do we do that? We slow down. What's leading me to think this way? We reflect on our identities, our privileges, our social location, what advantages have we had, what access do we have? And we think about the power in which we hold in comparison to youth of color. We understand that a certain set of an individual's identities mirror a unique set of opportunities and challenges. And just to ground ourselves in more perspective-taking thought processes, as you perspective take, next slide, I want you to reflect on imbalanced, reciprocal, or balanced power relationships. This is super important. I've said power so much today, but I really want you to take away that there is so much power that is being navigated in this relationship between youth and caregiver. And so really, be curious with yourself if you are giving youth an opportunity to collaborate with you around how things are happening in the home. Recognize that meaning well is not enough. We gotta put some action behind it. We wanna redirect our protection of the privileged to the underprivileged, or those who are under-resourced, who have less resource in that frame of mind, or who have less power. We always wanna do that. And I can't say it enough, we have to resist this false notion of equality. More than anything, we're honoring equity here, right? Giving an opportunity to not just say, blanketly that everyone has opportunity and access to equal measure of things, but knowing that that's not true, and working to give those who have less more so that they can even be on a similar level, which takes time, to those who have always had more. So really highlight and support equity rather than equality, and refuse to be silent. Give yourself an opportunity, even if your voice shakes, to speak up in anxiousness, and share when something doesn't sit right, doesn't look good. Next slide. And just quickly, can you do slide 35? Oh, yes. So conversations about racism and bias. Just next slide. So just quickly, I just want to acknowledge, these are just two considerations we're going to talk about, but the importance of conversations about bias and racism is that you need to be talking about things that are uncomfortable for you. You need to share with youth and create space, whether it's scheduled or flexible, where you are acknowledging that their race, their cultural identity, their social location, how their position in this world is of value to you. And even if you haven't had these conversations in the past, it's important for you to start to do them, even in anxiety now. Practice with those who you are connected to. Give yourself an opportunity to do this much more than you're doing it now. Okay, and I'll turn it over to Susanna.
Yes, Thank you. Yes, and just how we have to be mindful about the youth's identities and cultural backgrounds and racial backgrounds and ethnic backgrounds, our own, right, as well. So we are all racial and cultural, ethnically, informed human beings. So being really aware of your own background. So I invite you, as we do this slide, really think about the own privileges you hold and how they affect your connections, your decision making, your willingness to have these conversations with youth that you foster youth, and maybe your need to have these conversations as well, right? Some of you might be like, well, we don't really have to have these conversations. And some of you might be really like, yes, we do. And I can see in the chat, we'll hopefully address these and at the end here, but being able to be really mindful of your own positionality as well, just like we did in the beginning. So thank you for pulling this one on. So these are just some considerations that we invite you to keep in mind. This whole idea of the myth of the color blindness, right? This idea that we are colorblind, that we see every human being as a human being, and that's it, right? So this idea that we talk about, like, if we could just treat each other as human beings, then we can all get along. Yeah, but oftentimes when we think about a human being and what's defined in the human being, and from a book, a textbook, to our experiences, a human being looks like a majority, right? So in the United States specifically, it can look like the white experience. And so being able to really acknowledge that color blindness and no biases is not a reality. We are working all towards against those, and hopefully we achieve that. But race does matter, unfortunately. I wish that in my lifetime and in your lifetime, we will see where race doesn't matter. And really, we can really go into human beings, and that's it. But the reality of our life right now is that race does matter. And if we ignore that, it really puts a burden in our relationships, and especially with youth as we're trying to build a relationship with them, because we're ignoring their background. And if we ignore their background, guess what? You're ignoring them, right? So you're not just ignoring a little piece of them, you're ignoring who they are. And also this idea, really be mindful of cultural misinformation. Our brain, I always say, is so smart. It's amazing, and it does so many things, but it also likes to categorize things and put people and things in categories. So when we think of human beings, sometimes our brain goes into generalizing or stereotyping, or that these perceived conceptions of what a certain group of people do or don't do, right? And yes, there's some similarities in our backgrounds, but not always, right? So really being able to recognize that there's cultural variations is so critical as part of your cultural humility as a caregiver with foster youth, and your cultural competency as well. And then if we could go to the next one. So, and being able to really acknowledge that sometimes our support or statements of support might not be the best and might be inappropriate, and that's okay. So there will be tears in our relationships, but it's important to do some repairs. So really listening to them and asking them is the best way to prevent some inappropriate statements of support. So being able to acknowledge things of, like, I would love to hear what you're going through, instead of saying things like, I know what you're going through. No, maybe you don't, especially if you are from a different background than them. And especially if you are coming from more of a privileged background than them, they are gonna feel like that's maybe dismissive or fake. And adolescents, youth, they will call us out on that sometimes, and oftentimes to do that. So being able to recognize that, like, I don't know everything, and I haven't lived through that experience, so let me hear it from them. So we can go to the next one. Another consideration is to be really mindful of how we value or devalue spirituality for them. So maybe we're not very spiritual, maybe we are, but being able to recognize the importance for some youth on their spirituality or family belief system, or vice versa, right? Being able to be mindful of our own statements and our own background, our own belief system, our worldview on what that means for them. And then if you could just, if it's okay, you could just advance to all the bullet points. That's great. Also being really mindful of not taking it personally when we're building a new relationship, or maybe someone that's lived with us for a while and we're getting to know each other, is really important to not take things personally. And interpersonal caution might mean that we are aware that it's not always about us, and we are there to support, especially if we're the caregiver or the adult there, and being able to acknowledge that and being able to be supportive. And also unwillingness or inability to use the feedback, right? So no parent or caregiver can ever expect to always get it right. You're going to mess up. I will tell you that even after this training, after hundreds of training, you're going to mess up. We can't, say it always correctly or have these very difficult conversations in the best way possible. But if we're able to acknowledge, hey, I don't know everything and I can mess up and I'm going to mess up and I'm trying my best and this is what I'm trying to do, then it's going to be really important part of the conversation. And there's often this fear of talking about cultural identity and race, right? It's almost that as if talking about race or cultural identity will pull us apart even more, or makes us racist in some way. We see nationally this narrative of like, nope, let's not talk about race, because then that acknowledges that we're different in some way, and then I'm going to be more racist, or people are racist if they talk about race. We've seen that. But the reality is that youth may not necessarily verbalize always how their cultural identities and backgrounds impact them, because they're also figuring it out as you're figuring it out and everybody's figuring it out, but it is playing a role. And unless the caregiver is able to recognize that cultural identity and race does matter and it is important to them, and being able to provide that space for them, then the youth might be discontent, or we might wonder what is happening here. Where is the missing part here of our connection? That is really important that we talk about these things, because guess what? Talking about these things are going to be important because they're already thinking about them anyways, right? So putting it out there and having these conversations will be very important. We can advance to the next slide. So some of the discussion prompts that we want to invite you to consider can be kind of simple, maybe not so simple, but they can be kind of questions like this that you can feel free to ask the youth that you are fostering or living with temporarily or more long-term. Is how does our cultural identity and race impact the way we connect with foster youth, right? So how does that impact the way we connect with each other, right? And what cultural traditions do you want to continue to do here, right? Which ones do you want to continue and to do in this space, in this home, and that you value, and which ones maybe you never liked in the first place and you want to make sure that we don't continue to do. And so having these conversations or these prompts can really stem those conversations further on. Next slide, please. I'm going to leave some time for a question. So I'm not going to have time to go through all of these, and there's no recipe, right, to give you. I wish we could give you like, these are 10 tips and do these things and you're going to be able to talk about these things in an easier way. But the most important one is take time to slow down and take time to build a relationship with the youth that you are working with, that you are loving, that you are part of their new family, right? So take that time. Don't assume things. Don't assume things of their cultural background. Don't assume things of their racial background, their identities. Get to know them just like they're getting to know themselves, and part of that development of adolescence, childhood and adolescent. Ask when you don't know. Ask. It's okay to ask. And they love to teach us things. Tell me more about your culture. Tell me about your background. Tell me more about how you, how you grew up. Be patient with that process, right? Don't compare them to others and be like, well, this other youth, that was also from this part of the world or this background did it this way. No, let them help you understand their experience, and don't give up. Don't give up on them. Keep asking questions. Keep life in context, right? Really knowing beyond who they are, their community. And I think that can move us towards striving for cultural competence and humility. Cultural humility is this idea that we are never, ever going to get to this place of full cultural competence because we don't know. We don't know them. I don't know every cultural background and I don't know everyone, just like maybe you don't, right? Being able to stay humble in that way, but always curious. Continue to foster resilience and thriving in them, and being able to advocate for them, especially if they come from a background where not a lot of people have advocated for them, or they have oppressive, when we talk about intersectionality and identities that have been oppressed in some way, being able to amplify their voices within your home and with you and say, this is a space where we value and we amplify your experience, right? And don't only be their voice, but help them find their own voice, which is part of that growing up and being an adolescent as well. So Dominique will talk about how some additional considerations at policy levels as well.
Yeah, so thank you, Susanna. And next slide, Taylor. So just very quickly, I'm not going to go into detail about these, but as you sit in this space as caregivers who might actually want their advocacy to look like, how do I take this to the policy level? How do I, become a part of a board or like sit in spaces where I can actually contribute my own understanding and my own experiences to bettering the ways in which we talk about and think about fostering youth of color in general? Be curious about kinship care and, family, like relationships between children and their original families, whatever that looks like, right? It might not always be biological. Really figure out ways that we can ask children about what is important for them about maintaining certain family relationships that they had prior. Always dare to share power. It's super important. And what I mean by prevention over crisis is creating a space to sit in acknowledgement around how do we identify things that lead to better outcomes rather than having to work from a negative outcome backwards. So prioritize doing more of prevention rather than crisis management. And next slide. And this is Susanna and one of our favorite quotes, and it's by the lovely James Baldwin. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. So more ground yourself in this as we end today. We'll take about 5 minutes to ask for any questions. And if there is time, or if we're open to staying a little bit extra, maybe we'll see if we can answer as many questions as possible. And thank you all for hanging with us, especially through some of the technology differences or challenges. It happens, right? But we're thankful that you've been engaging with us today.
Yes. I do have a question in the chat, Dominique, that got sent to me. I don't know if you see it. I don't think so. Maybe it was accidentally just sent to me, but it's really interesting. It says, I'm curious on your thoughts on how to respond, assist with my 14-year-old Hispanic youth where Spanish was spoken at bio home, whose 2 younger sisters have been adopted by a non-Hispanic family who have changed the 12-year-old sister's name to a quote unquote American one. And there is no Spanish spoken. And when the children have a once-a-month visit with the Spanish-speaking grandparents, the girls were no longer participating in the conversation. My youth is struggling. And then it kind of goes on. I will just put it out there. This makes me so sad. When I first introduced myself of being reclaiming like and I talked about Indigenous background and stripping away, right, from our cultural identities. It's not just like a little slice of this individual, of this child. They're stripping away who she is. And one of the parts is language. With language, it's not just words, culture and traditions and connection, and who they are comes with language. And one of the ways they do that is stripping away from their name. And so I wish we could fix this. I think this is a very inappropriate thing to do. I think it's a very, I'm going to put it out there, it's a very racist thing to do to this child. So I can see your hesitation and your worry for that. Yeah.
Yeah, I have nothing else to add. I think it's perfectly been said by Susanna. And just one thing is, just again, want to reiterate that language is culture, language is character. And so when we strip that from a child, we are limiting them to their culture and their character. And so, you know, if we had more time, we can definitely go.
But maybe validating with, you know, the youth that is in your home, your youth, because this is their sibling, being able to acknowledge and say, yes, I see it with you. And not always can we fix it right away, right? We can talk about policies and advocacy and your own role with that, and maybe who you can tell what is happening and not. But with her, I think acknowledging and saying, I see it as well, and that's not okay. And that can be powerful too.